My dear students and viewers, this is Puranjay Biswas, Professor and Chairman, Department of English, Dhaka College, affiliated with the University of Dhaka. I welcome you to my today's lecture. I want to discuss an apology for poetry written by Sir Philip Sidney. Particularly, I want to focus on the 4 charges brought against poetry by Stephen Gusson and other followers of Gusson who made bitter criticism against poetry. When I want to discuss Sidney's apology for poetry, I can't but remember Plato and Aristotle. You know that Plato, in his masterpiece, The Republic, makes bitter criticism against poetry and poets. He thinks that the poets have no role in commonwealth or the ideal state. And Plato suggests the poets to be banished from his ideal world or commonwealth. My dear students, on the contrary, Aristotle, who was the disciple, the student of Plato, had different stands regarding poetry. He says that poetry is not something that tells us lies. It is not the imitation of imitation, as Plato says. According to Aristotle, poetry is an art of imitation, and poetry represents life, but not as it is, but what it should be or might be, according to probability or necessity. He further says that poetry tells us universal truths, whereas history tells us only the dead past or the individual fact that took place in the past. And history can't tell us something universal that poetry can do. Thus, in his Poetics, Aristotle expresses his opinion in defense of poetry. Now, Sir Philip Sidney, as I have already mentioned before, that he is a brainchild of Aristotle in respect of his position in favor of poetry. He follows Aristotle's concept regarding poetry. In my previous class, I discussed Sidney's definition of poetry, which was based on Aristotle's concept that poetry is an art of imitation. It figures forth something. Sidney says that poetry is a speaking picture, and the aim of poetry is to teach and delight. Thus, Sidney has established the superiority of poetry. Sidney, on the one hand, appreciates poetry with so many arguments and logical points of view. he shows that in the past, both in civilized and cultured countries as well as in late cultured or uncivilized races, there was poetry. That is, poetry had great value in the past. As for example, Sidney gives some references to ancient Greece and Rome. Greece is called the home of civilization. And in the past, the Greek people had high appreciation of poetry as well as poets. They regarded a poet to be a maker, to be a creator. And the Roman people regarded a poet to be Dept. And Dept means a diviner, a foreseer, and a prophet. That is, a poet is someone who has inner spiritual side, a divinity. In the uncivilized countries in the past, there was no literacy, no learning, but they had their poetry. Sidney also says that poetry is the most antique and fatherly art. It is the earliest form of writing. It is the earliest form of learning. So he says that poetry is the first light giver. Poetry gives us milk just like a nurse. As milk prepares a baby to digest solid wood in future, in the same way, poetry makes us able to understand tougher subjects like philosophy, sciences, and so on. Sidney says that poetry is the origin of all other branches of knowledge and learnings. He says that the other branches of learnings and knowledge must have to take passport from poetry. Not only that, according to Sidney, a scientist is first a poet, then a scientist. Thus, in the initial paragraphs of his text, Sidney tries to establish great value and necessity of poetry in our life. Because poetry, on the one hand, teaches us, on the other hand, delights us. Poetry teaches us and moves us to pursue. And the path of poetry is very easy, pleasant, and full of delight, and it leads us to the goal. That is, poetry teaches us through delight and pleasure that other form of learning can't. As for example, Sidney says that philosophy can teach only the taught, and philosophy teaches us only through precept, abstract precept, without any concrete example. On the other hand, history can only teach us through concrete examples, but it fails to give us general precept or universal idea or knowledge. So both history and philosophy have their shortcomings and limitations, but poetry possesses these two qualities that both philosophy and history lack. That is, on the one hand, poetry gives us general abstract precept. On the other hand, it teaches us through concrete example. Thus, Sidney establishes the superiority of poetry to all other branches of knowledge and learning. After this discussion, Sidney comes to mention the four charges, the four objections to poetry brought by Stephen Gusson. And Sidney has mentioned these four objections to poetry. And what are those? Let me mention. First of all, it is said that we should spend our time in more fruitful subjects, more useful subjects, rather than poetry. According to Gusson and Gong, poetry is a useless subject, and to spend time in poetry is nothing but to waste our time. So, they suggest that we should spend our valuable time in all those valuable, important subjects rather than poetry. And this is the first argument of Gusson and his followers. Now the second objection. The second objection to poetry is that poetry is the mother of lies. That is, poets are liars. So this is a very serious objection to poetry. Here, Gusson follows Plato's concept, as Plato says that poetry is the imitation of imitation. That is, poetry can give us nothing real or true. Rather, it takes us in some fantasy kingdom. So, it is said that poetry tells lies, and poets are great liars. Now, the third objection. The third objection against poetry is that poetry is the nurse of abuses. That is, poetry is something that leads us to vices, perversion. It leads us to the path of immorality and destruction. a siren misguides us and leads us to the poisonous snake in disguise. In the same way, poetry, with its sweetness and magical power, misguides us. Particularly, it misguides the young people to sexuality, perversion, immorality. This is the third objection. Now, the fourth charge against poetry is that Plato, our greatest philosopher, speaks against poetry in his Republic. Gosson and his followers want to mean that Plato is our great master. We should follow him. He is our guide, the most important and the greatest philosopher of the world. As he banishes the poets from the commonwealth, as he speaks against poetry, so we, the followers of Plato, should abandon the poets. We should reject poetry, following Plato. So they have used Plato as a shield against poetry. So all these are the fundamental charges or objections that Gosson brought against poetry. But Sidney, after mentioning all these objections in his text, he now refutes all the charges through his argument, through his logistic points. Just like an advocate, point by point, he refutes the charges and he defends poetry against all those baseless, groundless objections to poetry. Now, let me focus how Sidney tries to establish his argument and logic in defense of poetry against all those four charges. Sidney says that Gosson and the haters of poetry are right, saying that man should use their valuable time in more fruitful subjects. Right? He supports them, but he says that according to Sidney, there is no other subject in the world which is more valuable, more fruitful than poetry. Because poetry teaches us and moves us to truth and virtue. And in the way poetry gives us charm, fascination, and attractions. Poetry fascinates the readers to poetry, to understand poetry, to have teaching from poetry. No other subject can teach us and move us to virtue as poetry can do. So, showing their logic, very ironically, Sidney wants to mean that as poetry is more valuable, more useful, more fruitful than any other art, any other learning, we should give our time, we should spend our time to poetry. This is the first defense. Now, the second defense. The second objection is that poetry is the mother of lies. But Sidney says that it's not right. Poetry is not the mother of lies. Or rather, poetry is the mother of truth, mother of universal truth. Because poetry teaches us universal truth. What should happen or what might happen is presented in poetry. Poetry never affirms anything. So there is the least possibility of telling lies. Just like an advocate, very technically, Sidney says that a poet never tells a lie. If he tells a lie, he lies the least, because a poet never affirms strongly anything. Rather, a poet says what should happen or might happen. So there is the possibility of something to happen according to possibility, according to necessity, on the basis of circumstances. So a poet has this capacity, has this ability to forecast what should happen or what might happen. Sidney says that those who affirm something definitely may tell lies. As for example, a scientist can tell a lie because a scientist gives warranty and guarantee that something must happen. Absolutely. A scientist says that absolutely it will happen. But in fact, even in science, there is no absolute truth. What a scientist told in the past has been proved false or harmful at present. As for example, I want to mention once it was thought that the sun moves around the earth, and the astronomer like Ptolemy had this proof and belief, and the world accepted that the sun moved around the earth. But this scientific concept changed when Copernicus, Galileo established further evidences against the past concept, and they have become successful to give more evidences that it is not the sun but the earth that moves around the sun. And now we believe it. So the scientific concept may change time to time because they affirm something. So there is the possibility to tell lies. In this way, Sidney says that it is not poetry that tells lies. Rather, poetry tells us universal truth, and the poets are never liars. They speak the truth and they worship the truth. They are the lover of truth. This is the second defense of Sidney. Now the third objection is that poetry is the nurse of abuse. That means poetry preaches something destructive, something immoral, something false, and thus poetry misguides and takes us to the wrong path. So, like a nurse, poetry abuses and corrupts us. But Sidney says that no, never. Poetry never corrupts us, misguides us. And poetry is not the nurse of abuses. Rather, poetry is the nurse that gives us first nutritive food, liquid food, that is milk. As milk is essential for a baby, in the same way, poetry is just like milk given by the nurse for a newborn baby. So poetry is just like the milk to those people who are ignorant. Because poetry gives us knowledge, gives us truth, and it never misguides us. Rather, poetry guides us to the right paths with teaching, with virtues, with morality. Sidney says that he shows an example that think of a sword. You can use a sword to kill your father, or you can use a weapon to defend your country, to protect your country. So you can use a sword, a weapon to kill your father or to defend your country. So this weapon, this sword is not responsible at all. The responsibility goes to the user. So if one uses poetry for something evil purpose, that person, that user is responsible to abuse poetry. You can use poetry for the nobler purpose, for our greater purpose, for virtue, for truth, for delight. So, poetry itself is not at all responsible for any abuse or misuse. Thus, he defends poetry against the fourth charge. He says that it is not poetry that abuseth us, rather it is our wit that corrupteth poetry. Now the fourth defense against fourth objection. The fourth objection is that Plato speaks against poetry. The fourth charge is that Plato banished poets from his commonwealth. That's why we should also reject poetry and we should abandon the poets. But in defense, Sidney says that this is the difficult task for him to show defense against this church. It is difficult in this sense that he is astonished, thinking that how it is possible for Plato to speak against poetry, because Plato himself used poetry in his philosophical dialogue, in his philosophical writing. He himself uses poetry. The same person can speak against poetry. This is very absurd to him. He shows argument that, in fact, Plato is not the hater of poetry. He is not against poetry. Rather, he is for poetry. How? How he is for poetry? Sidney explains that Plato speaks against the abuses of poetry and he tries to remove all those abuses from poetry, and thus rejecting all those demerits and abuses of poetry. In fact, Plato tries to purify poetry. He wants to justify poetry. So the person who wants to purify poetry by removing all the abuses, he cannot be an enemy to poetry. He cannot be hater of the poets. Rather, Sidney says, Plato is a patron of poetry. He is a patron of poetry. Thus, Sidney uses Plato as a shield in defense of poetry against those who use Plato against poetry. By this I want to mean that Sidney shows logic to establish that Plato is not actually an enemy to poetry. Rather, he is a patron to poetry. By removing the abuses of poetry and purifying poetry, he in fact stands for poetry. My students and viewers, we can't buy support our great philosopher Aristotle. We can't go against Sidney, the first English critic. It is right. Poetry is an art of imitation. Poetry tells us never any truth. Poetry is the mother of truth, universal truth. So, let us sing of poetry. Let us sing of our great poets. Thank you. See you next. All the best.